Namaste, and welcome to the first Fireside conversation of Vichaar Manthan's Sustainable Narratives Conference 2020. My name is Sumit Sharma, and it is my great privilege to open up the first Fireside conversation. I volunteer my time with Vichaar Manthan because we like to earnestly explore ideas. By no means do we call ourselves experts. By no means am I offering any conclusions. All of our Vichaar Manthans and Fireside conversations are put in place to help you guys at home to think about what sustainability is, the topics that we're discussing, understand how we can benefit society through liberty, through plurality. If you haven't seen any of the other events that we're putting on for Sustainable Narratives, I urge you to look at vichaarmanthan.org, sign up to one of our VMs that are talking about the 5 cornerstones of society, and have a look at the Fireside conversations. We've got some real top-notch speakers, and I promise you, you don't want to miss this. This session here today is about understanding a very prevalent character, someone who has polarized the world. Some people love him, some people hate him. We know that the media certainly paint him out. Of course, I'm talking about Donald Trump and what that really means for nationalism in the United States of America. To help me do that, I'm very pleased and privileged to bring Suhag Shukla to the table. Suhag ji is the Executive Director of the Hindu American Foundation. She's been a lawyer by training, and I will let her introduce some more of herself. But before we go on to that, I just want to set the scene for what we're doing here today. Donald Trump is a polarizing global figure. He is out to create a new world in his own accord. He has said America comes first. He has systematically weakened international institutions and encouraged nationalism all over the world. I encourage everyone at home to leave some comments in the YouTube stream, follow the rest of what we're doing for the next couple of days, and earnestly help us explore ideas such as understanding Trump. Suhag ji, thank you for joining us. For our many viewers at home, could you please introduce yourself and let the viewers know what we're in for?
Sure. Namaste, everyone. My name is Suhag Shukla. I am the Executive Director and a co-founder of the Hindu American Foundation. The Hindu American Foundation was founded in 2003, and we are primarily second generation Hindu Americans who were largely born and raised in the United States and felt that there was a void in terms of a Hindu voice in the public square. And so with that very lofty vision, we started this foundation. We also were committed to professionalizing the organization. So we set out with a goal of creating an institution that would have a full-time staff, which we do. We have 11 full-time staff, and we have headquarters in Washington, D.C. Our mission is essentially to improve the understanding of Hindus and Hinduism through education and advocacy. And in order to carry out our mission, we work directly with educators, we work with publishers, we work with journalists to ensure an accurate understanding of Hindus and Hinduism through both a proactive and a responsive approach. We also work with policymakers and with key stakeholders to champion issues of concern to Hindu Americans, including defending civil rights and human rights and the protection of all living beings, including our planet. In our approach to policymaking, we try to approach some of the greatest challenges that we are facing, not just as Americans, but as citizens of our planet through a dharmic lens and in a way in which we feel is being true to the core fundamentals of Dharma. And to that end, we are nonpartisan when it comes to the American political spectrum. And just to give maybe a quick overview for maybe members in the audience who may not be familiar with the American political spectrum, it's largely just two ends of a spectrum. You have Democrats and Republicans. And so the Democrats, in very coarse, simplistic terms, are probably known to want to create safety nets and to have larger governments to ensure that all of the needs of our society are met. Republicans tend to favor smaller governments. So whether it's dealing with trade, our economy, social programs and everything, that's kind of the overarching. Now that's really simplifying it, but just to give people some perspective of some of the things that we'll be talking about today. And I will just say one more thing in terms of our conversation today, because the Hindu American Foundation is nonpartisan. And, you know, as you rightly said, Sumit, that President Donald Trump is a polarizing figure. And so there's a lot of opinions and perspectives when you have any kind of conversation about him or his or the government that he's running. And so in order to kind of approach this conversation in earnest, I put my lawyer hat on. I don't think my lawyer hat actually comes off at any point, but I approached the topic in a way that I think a lawyer would, in terms of let's assess all the different perspectives. And that's exactly what I did. That I took a very non-scientific, I'm not a political scientist or a sociologist or a psychologist, but I took my own non-scientific approach of talking to four people who are on the spectrum of what you might describe as supporters of President Trump and are registered Republicans or independents, which is a rarity. And I spoke to four individuals who are lifelong Democrats and also kind of on the spectrum on the left, ranging from, you know, further left to the center. And they all represent, I think, different spheres of the Hindu American and largely Indian American community in terms of age, gender, and professional background. So I spoke to small business owners, I spoke to a lawyer, I spoke to some retirees. So as we go through our conversation on a variety of aspects of the president and his policies and the impact, that's kind of who I will be referring back to.
So the good lawyer needs to caveat themselves, of course.
Yes, of course.
Well, you know, and I encourage everyone at home to just think about Vichaar Manthan is that unbiased platform. This is the whole point of this conference for the next 4 days, is to explore such ideas. And I think that leads me straight into the pertinent topic. What brought Trump to power?
Okay.
Why do you think he's popular?
Right. Now, this could actually very well take up our entire time. So I'm just going to give a very high level overview, and it's not by any means going to be comprehensive. The first thing I'll say is that the simplistic answer would be racism, white fragility, anti-immigrant sentiment. Those are things that you very often see in the media. Now, is that part of it? Possibly. Or probably for one segment or some segments. But I don't think that that is an honest assessment of all the variety of things that led to this kind of extraordinary and very unexpected and unpredictable moment. Because as we were going into the election, I mean, I remember staying up till 2 a.m., just kind of watching, going, really? I mean, people went to bed at 11 just expecting a particular, it was going to be Hillary Clinton. America was set to have their first female president. But I think there were enough road posts that people just ignored that would have made this predictable. So I think that there's three larger trends. There's probably a fourth, but we can talk about that later on. The first is disillusionment, alienation, and frustration. There's been this kind of growing sense that, and as this is largely, I don't think it's limited to the working class of Americans and small towns where factories were kind of the lifeblood of these communities. I think you see it even on the coasts. That's maybe something else that I should share with listeners, is that there very often is kind of a feeling that the coasts, whether it's the East Coast or the West Coast, tend to be what people might talk about like elite, more educated. That doesn't mean that that's a monolith, but these are just kind of broad, overarching, categories, I suppose. And it's the middle America that may not necessarily, that's where like you find the predominance of people who are working class, who may not be college educated, that are not as diverse, meaning they're more white. Again, these are like very broad. That does not mean you're not going to find, Indian Americans in the middle of America, or African Americans, or whatever else. So going back to what I was talking about, you have this sense that politicians don't care about the working class. And so if politicians don't care about them, then they can't take care of them. So to this end, I think that, the president's outsider anti-establishment message really resonated. And so I'll give you kind of a quote from one of the people that I surveyed. He said that, quote, "He isn't a seasoned politician. He's an outsider, not an establishment candidate. He's a business person. Republicans didn't want him to be president, neither did Democrats." So I thought that was really telling, that just kind of like this shock that that at least many in the country were facing. So I think that that's one trend. A second one is kind of economic anxieties. And so what have we seen in the United States? We've seen falling wages. So back in 1940, for instance, 90% of children born in 1940 could expect that they would make more money than their parents. Fast forward to 1980, only 40% would have done so. And, just looking at some of the conversations that I have with younger people, including my own children, I have a 21-year-old and a 17-year-old, they are not confident that they would necessarily do better than us. So I haven't seen the latest trends in terms of, what does a child born in 2000 or 2020, what does that look like? Will they make more than their parents? So certainly that's there. What has lent to that is, I think, a triad. And these are, again, I'm not an expert. I'm speaking from my own experience and observations, but also what people who are far more knowledgeable on these topics have said. But globalization, automation, and professionalization. This has left millions of Americans, and especially those without college education, out of the story of economic growth. So jobs have been shipped overseas. Manpower has been replaced with machine power. College degrees, I've talked about working class, but college degrees have essentially become a prerequisite for the middle class. That wasn't necessarily the case. And all of this has contributed to increasing income inequality.
Sure.
So what, go ahead.
We'll touch on something there. So in the first point, we were talking about middle America, the Rust Belt, or the previous generations to have hoped to be earning more than generations before them. Has that not happened? Whose fault is that? What's gone wrong here? And because of that wrongness, are the people disenfranchised? They don't believe in the establishment.
I think that it's almost a feedback loop on so many of these things, right? Whether you call it chicken or egg or a feedback loop, everything is interrelated. So they have largely been left out of this story. When you have factories that are focused on making cars, for instance, they're if you make it difficult, or if it's difficult, let me phrase it another way. If it's cheaper for a company to ship the jobs overseas, they're going to do that. This is a capitalist society, right? So that is going to happen. And then even if machines need humans, right? Because machines are only as good as the input. So it's not like we've eliminated, even though artificial intelligence is trying to do that, even though we haven't eliminated the need for humans behind these machines, it takes a certain level of skill. You have to have access. But even beyond access, you have to have interest. If I'm a 50-year-old worker who's known the world in a particular way, that's a steep climb. So I think that I don't know that that's a fallacy or a perception issue. I think it's grounded in reality. Um, Interestingly, going back to kind of like that simplistic way that this was, that there might be racist motivations, or this was kind of a response to having our first African American president for 2 terms, so 8 years. Some surveys show that amongst rural and working class whites, they used to traditionally vote Democrat because the Democrats were the ones who were more union friendly. And so you had more protections for workers. And in the past several decades, they have shifted to voting for Republican. But that's not the end of the story. Some surveys show that almost 1/3 of white working class who voted for President Obama twice, ended up voting for Trump. So I think that that is, whether it's his message as an outsider, whether it's his message of just saying, hey, yeah, this really sucks. Because on certain levels, you can say that globalization has been a good thing, and it has been, right? It has allowed for decreased cost of certain goods when you're looking at a consumer economy. It has leveled a global playing field, but what impact? There have been people who are left out, and here comes a candidate who says, and I'll actually quote one of the people that I surveyed, that most of all, President Trump believes in America first. He believes American products should be appreciated equally in the rest of the world. And then one of the things that I found interesting was that this part of what was said is, this person said, if he talked like President Reagan or President Obama, he would have been praised and well liked. So, going to this "Make America Great Again," that sometimes is like a trigger phrase for one side of the spectrum, and one of, this person hears me, as how that's taken in for others. So, as we talk further, there are a lot of these hints of communication issues that oscillate between, it's his straight talk and the media's biased, to the other end saying he's unconstructive and this is all harmful rhetoric. And then the third trend, I think, of how we ushered in the age of Trump, is just the traditional Republican voting blocs. White evangelicals, white mainline Christians, and white Catholics in swing states tend to vote, largely vote Republican, because there are certain things that are kind of going to happen in the next 3 to 5 years, primarily Supreme Court nominees. So those are lifetime appointments. We have 9 justices, and there are some who are in advanced age, and they tend to be the liberal justices. So that's an opportunity that does not come about often. He has already appointed 2 constitutional justices, or that have strict readings of the Constitution. So that's important for many voters. And I found it. Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
No, so you're running ahead there, and I think there's lots of pertinent topics built into what you've said. So I just want to reflect on a moment about. I was going to ask, why is he so polarizing? We said earlier that the Republicans didn't want him, Democrats didn't want him, but here we have a man who has been a billionaire, has lived through America for, he's over 70 years old, so he's seen the tides change, and he's able to communicate with the majority of the people. So I think we'd agree to say that he talks to the concerns of the people, and showing and maybe exposing the fact that there is a demise of expertise, or a loss of faith in the establishment. Hence, so many people are so forthcoming with having him here. I want to move on to so look, prejudice aside, right? Everyone can have comments about Trump, and let's not necessarily focus on Trump the person, but Trump the idea, the character. So what do you think world order looks like for a Trump supporter? What is it that they might mostly appreciate about his approach?
So, because he's we've talked about, well, let me just make it more simple. I talked to both sides. I know we talked about, what does the world look like for a Trump supporter, but I thought it would be important to also think about what does the world order look like to a critic, right? And what was interesting in my conversations with, my small sample survey was that both spoke of prioritizing America, but how you go about doing it is where those big differences come about in terms of approach, rhetoric, style, all of that stuff. But everyone I spoke to, whether they were Republican or Democrat, expressed concern for American workers, expressed concern for level playing fields, and in reinvesting in our own infrastructure. And so a supporter, it was interesting to me, wanted they were supportive of an America First position, but what you heard echoes of was it needed to come from a position of power and domination. And so, I heard things like Trump is not afraid of foreign leaders, or with his America First trade policies of imposing tariffs, he's made an equal playing field. He's fighting Islamist terrorism and strengthening borders. So you kind of get this like machismo, notion of, this is how America needs to be first. It's kind of like just push through and we are not going to budge. On the other end, you still have the same concern, but the language I felt evoked like wanting to be in a position of morality, that this is the better thing to do. And so I had actually a very hard time when I was speaking to from people who were registered Democrats to get them to say something positive, which goes, so I'd have to kind of push a little bit. No, I need to have at least one thing, like dig deep. And so it's interesting that at least one or two of them brought up the same thing, that he's been unusually frank with regards to major dangers like trade and tariffs and Islamist terrorism. But it's just interesting that even though the end result might be the same, it was the focus kind of tended to be on the way in which these things were carried out, that really was the key difference in what that world order looks like and what America's place is in it.
Yeah, for sure. And so someone with a no nonsense approach to terror. And you were saying about sort of foreign policy, he brought North Korea in line, brought them to the table, made them sign peace treaties, whatever it looks like.
ISIS, right?
So no one's dared to do things like that, or at least been so frank about it.
Mm-hmm.
And so look, economically, statistically, I think America is now producing more oil than anyone else. Oil production has gone through the roof. So you push away the pressures of the Middle East and China, and you put a red cap on with 4 words on it that speaks to the people. So there has to be, and look, I live in the UK, we only see Trump from what our news channels portray him as. You obviously being in America will have a different taste on that. And of course with the foundation and everything. So we can't just badmouth Trump all the time. It's far too easy. So maybe let's talk about some of Trump's actual successes. You know, what has he managed to do that some would argue is good? So oil production booming.
I think it largely depends on who you ask. And that seems to be the theme of our conversation in some sense. But I will say that the media plays a huge role in this, right? That you ask, and the funny thing is that if you try to sit in the center and you look at the media, and I do this on a just personally in my own practice of news consumption, and especially because I take very seriously the foundation's commitment to being nonpartisan. We have something called Fox News. It's a Rupert Murdoch channel, right? And then on the other end, you might have an MSNBC, which is known to be liberal. And I make a routine of swapping back and forth to try to see how is one event being presented. And, you know, I think that there has been especially more so on the right, I would say. But I think that if we're talking about Fox News, someone on the left would say the same thing, but a serious erosion of trust in the media because, you know, before and several things have contributed to that. 24-hour news cycle is definitely one of them, where it's not just reporting on the news, but it's editorializing, right? Yeah. And not knowing the difference between what is fact, what is opinion, and what is a lie. So all of these things have definitely shaped the perceptions towards successes, right? So when I talked to supporters, they could boom, 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 list off a number of successes, including what you brought up in terms of oil production. They talked about bringing down tariffs with Russia, Mexico, Europe, and Canada, saving America nearly $438 billion annually. Now, I don't know if these numbers are accurate. This is how these successes were conveyed to me by, you know, my small sample survey. The implementation of the biggest tax reform. And big tax cuts for corporations. So all of these things are listed, deregulation, all of these things are listed as successes from the Republicans that I was speaking to. On the other hand, and they felt very strongly that the media was unfair and therefore people do not know of all of these successes, right?
Part of the reason, so yeah, definitely about sort of news channels and who owns them and who portrays that side of things, which is why I think he's so hot on Twitter. So look, economically, statistically, from an outside view, we can assess America till we're blue in the face. Something we talked about earlier on, and you tipped your hat towards nationalism. So do we think America, or rather Trump, is stoking nationalism? And what is the nature of that nationalism?
So I think we need to be careful with the word nationalism because there are many types of nationalism. There is a cultural nationalism or a civic nationalism, which I think the better term for that is probably patriotism. And so, you know, when I think of American nationalism or patriotism, the things that come to mind are baseball and apple pie, Memorial Day and 4th of July parades, which is coming up in 2 days, but no parades this year because of the pandemic. Thanksgiving and American football, the promise of equal rights and opportunity, though that's not a promise that's necessarily been fulfilled for all Americans, certainly not for African Americans or Native Americans. And it's a message of unity in diversity, and it's largely inclusive nationalism.
Yeah, so even constitutionally, all of the above are things you would paint as American. And so, culturally, America is built on some of the, the forefathers, when it was all put together. It's about that cultural nationalism, the baseball team and all the rest of it together. But is that really what Trump wolf whistles towards? Is that what's happening?
So I would say that, some of the things that he tweets or has said, um, for those elements in American society, and we talked about them way early on in our conversation about, was there motivation among certain segments that was racist, anti-immigrant, for that segment, for them, they probably equate an American nationalism with an ethnic nationalism, right? One that is white, one that is Christian, and one that's an exclusivist nationalism. I would say that is one that's in the minority, in like a micro minority. So when President Trump says something or tweets something, they certainly view it as something that's speaking to them. And I think the vast majority who buy into a vision of a more inclusive nationalism or a civic nationalism are see that as him talking to them, right? But when we look at the policies, and this is what one of the people said, that yeah, sure, when he's disconnected from his teleprompter or he just talks off the cuff or from his tweets, he he reverts to kind of that straight shooting or whatever, and so that may be misconstrued, but show me the policies. Right now, on the other hand, people might say, well, there are policies right now. H-1Bs and green cards are at a standstill, and that largely affects a lot of people in the Hindu and Indian American community. But then, if I push back asking that sort of question, a supporter would say, yeah, but we're in the middle of a pandemic, so it's difficult to say, but largely speaking, there may be that, and there are some statistics that hate crimes have been on the rise. But I think it's so complicated. There's so many challenges that our country is facing in terms of the economy and all the things that we've talked about, that, if we fixed one thing, could it take away resentment, anti-immigrant sentiment, for instance? These are all things that I think that once we're out of the pandemic and we see maybe more policy making coming out from our government, that time will tell. There's the ideal of America. I certainly hold on to that ideal. I think we will live up to it.
So all great things about America having cultural nationalism. Trump perhaps capitalizing or silently giving a nod to that ethnic nationalism. Dangerous, maybe not dangerous, don't know. We're here to discover. And so for audience at home, we'd like you to leave some comments in the YouTube stream. Got a few hundred people tuned in right now. My question now, Suhagji, is just on that ethnic and cultural nationalism piece. Does that cultural patriotism start becoming an ethnic nationalism? Those people that think Trump is talking to them when they wear their red caps or whatever that looks like down at the ground level, are we moving away from what America was built on culturally to an ethnic standpoint? And I argue, is that anti-American?
I do think ethnic nationalism is anti-American. And I believe that the founding fathers built a governance system that will push back against that. And we already see that. I don't think an ethnic nationalism can ever take over the civic and cultural nationalism, because I think it's embedded into our Bill of Rights, into our Constitution, into the balance of powers. Now, in one administration, people have talked about and observers have expressed concern about some of the blurring of lines in those balance of powers. But I believe that, our history is not that long as a country, but it's long enough to know that things like this have happened in the past and the system self-corrects. So on a personal level, I have faith in the system, but others may not. But I think there are more Americans who do have faith in the system, and that's the beauty of a democracy. That we are a country of immigrants, and we have wrestled with our diversity, and there have been points in time where the newest kid on the block is not welcome, and then slowly over time they get absorbed into it, still maintaining some of their identity and their culture, but they do buy into kind of this larger vision of a civic nation of immigrants.
Awesome. And I think it's humbling to hear, you have faith in the system. So, red, white, and blue with the Tiranga as well, maybe.
Yes.
Hopefully sustainability comes back to America in a stronger way. And I think we're trying to explore some of those themes. So we're talking about governance. Just before this session, we had a session on governance with the likes of Ra Madhav, Steve Sang, and Andy. So again, for the viewers at home, please tune in, watch that, give us your comments. Okay, so Haji, let's move off this nationalism topic. Of course, we could continue if we wanted, but let's move on to foreign affairs. Look, America, the free world, the biggest, baddest boy on the block, international leadership. So, USA has undoubtedly been the pioneer of safeguarding liberty and democracy. Do you think America can continue to do so?
I'm going to try. I'm trying to.
Under Trump, right?
Yeah.
So,
I think so. I think it goes. I know we're talking about President Trump, but I think it goes beyond President Trump. That the United States, we have a lot of challenges in our country. And I think for me, and I'm going to now, I guess, speak in my own capacity, because we do work in the policy space, that whether it was President Bush, whether it was President Obama, or whether it's President Trump, we have some inbuilt challenges. I think the United States has kind of taken on a glass house approach where we've oftentimes cast stones, right, in trying to be the moral leader. And I think it worked for a while, but we have our own challenges as the world is seeing today, whether it's, how the strongest democracy and a global economic leader is dealing with the challenges of a pandemic, or whether it's racial justice and the promise of our Constitution, and whether those promises of equality and equal opportunity are there for all Americans, especially in a globalized world where information sharing is so easy. I think that we do need to have some introspection. I still think that the system that's built is one that is worthy of emulation. And to that end, America needs to remain a leader. And I don't think that any one president or that might have a cult of personality around them changes that. But there are other critics who believe that 4 years and if it looks like 8 years could affect that moral standing. None of us have a crystal ball. We can have this conversation again in 8 years if President Trump wins again in November.
Yeah. Sustainable narratives 2028. Look out. So this view of introspection, becoming insular, what does that do for the rest of the world, or at least the liberal world? Any society that puts its borders up, disenfranchises foreign aid and the rest of it. America, or rather Trump, has began this rhetoric of it's all about us. We should start here. So a society that does that, surely it begins to decay. Surely Trump's visions of liberty and making America great again and the rest of it, can that be a bad thing? What does that say to other societies? What does that say to other countries? What kind of leadership does that show?
That's a good question. I think that that's a tough question. So in terms of what does it show the world? I think it depends.
What should it show?
What should it show? I think that there needs to be a balance in that I'll take a very personal, I guess, analogy where, as a mother, I know that I have to take care of myself in order to be able to take better care of others. Now, I'm not saying that's necessarily the motivation. Certainly that hasn't been something articulated, but I'm just speaking from my own sense of the world and how I look at what the role of an individual is, and then take it to a macro level of a country. Does a country need to take care of itself in order to take a better care of other people? Well, going back to what I just said, that if we have our challenges here as Americans with civil rights and racial injustice, how are we then to be a champion of human rights around the world? If we have our own workers suffering, if we don't figure out how do we lift all boats internally, how are we to then lift all boats globally? Now, that doesn't mean that you need to completely take your foot off the pedal and just fully focus on that on your internal needs. Going back to that analogy, I can't just say, well, I'm going to step out of being a mom and a wife and the executive director of HF because I need to take care of me. You kind of have to take care of both. So I think that America's role, I don't believe that we need to take an or approach. We need to take an and approach and ensure that Americans are taken care of, and at the same time ensure that all of these global institutions that were built after World War II are also taken care of, because we are all on this planet together. COVID has been such a reminder of that. And no one can, in this day and age, or no one has ever really, I think it would have been delusional to think that you can be an island on a planet that's isolated. COVID has been a very stark reminder of our interconnectedness and the need to work together.
Okay, awesome. Thank you very much for that. And I know we're pushed for time. Lots of comments coming through on YouTube, thanking the audience again. Please leave some further comments. So Arji, coming towards the end now, I'm sure we could talk for more time. Will America still be the greatest superpower, culturally, politically, in 2050? In your view?
Yes. Here's why. Because the United States is home to a little piece of every part of the world. And if we can take our responsibility that we have as American citizens to ensure that we are looking to the well-being of not just all people, but our planet, and we have elements of that. I think that the institutions that are supposed to carry out the framework of our legal system and our governance system, I think that there are definitely weaknesses, but there have been weaknesses in the past, and the country has self-corrected. And I am an optimist in that end, to that end, and therefore I do believe that the United States will be a leader. I don't know, though, necessarily whether it will be a leader on its own. I think that it's important for all countries to do well because the planet is interconnected, and I don't think that one country can do well at the expense of other countries, and that's my personal opinion. And at the same time, that's balanced with, you have to take care of your own in order to take care of others.
Can't pour from an empty cup. Okay, thank you very much, Suhag. I think we're at the end of this discussion. I would, of course, love to stay and discuss further, and I'm sure Vichaar Manthan and the rest of the team will put some more of this together. We're here to discuss sustainable narratives. We're here to discuss what the 5 cornerstones of society look like. So Suhag, thank you once again for joining us. For everyone at home, please look Suhag up, look up the Hindu American Foundation and the fantastic work that she is doing. For everyone else tuning in to Sustainable Narratives Conference, this session has been about understanding President Donald Trump, understanding what the rise of American nationalism looks like, and really trying to tease out the nuances of what that does for global society, what that does for the rest of society as we grow and learn. Right? The world is in dire need of some new narratives. What's happened so far, we don't know if it's working. We're here to discuss that and for the rest of this conference here today. So up on your screen now, you should be seeing what we've got coming up in the next few days. Tomorrow, we have Deconstructing Postmodernism with Kushal Mehra. That will be a fireside conversation. I hope I've done justice to this fireside conversation with enough masala. And then tomorrow, again, 6 p.m. BST will be our next Vichaar Manthan on institutionalizing religion. Can it be sustainable? And then we've got another fantastic fireside later on, which is on angrynomics. My name is Sumit Sharma. This has been Vichaar Manthan Sustainable Narratives Conference 2020. Thank you, good night, and I hope to see as many of you on the live stream tomorrow. Namaste.